Welcome back! So, last time I analysed the lost stories of Season 4, the Second Doctor's first run of episodes, and I asked myself whether I would have preferred any of their unmade concepts to the adventures we actually got on screen, and the conclusion I reached was... meh, not really. But anyway, today we do the same treatment for Season 5, my favourite set of adventures in the entirety of this franchise. Gee, I wonder how this video is going to turn out. Being conceived at least 2 years prior to its intended transmission, Douglas Camfield and Robert Kitts collaborated to come up with a concept for a 6-part adventure which they finally submitted for Season 5, with the idea on the drawing board forming into Operation Werewolf. The TARDIS arrives in Normandy 1944, just before D-Day. The Doctor is horrified to find out that the Nazis are developing a way to teleport their forces across the English Channel, and so he and the companions join the resistance to combat this, where they meet and team up with the descendant of Jamie. Producer Innes Lloyd showed moderate interest in the idea and commissioned the pair to write a draft script for episode 1, but that's as far as production ever went on it. It hung in limbo for a little while until being formally abandoned by the time Lloyd had stepped down from the role of producer. This is easily the most promising idea we've analysed so far, and it genuinely sounds like the recipe for a stellar story. Not only in terms of the intriguing conspiracy that the main conflict seems to provide, but also it sounds like an opportunity for some great character drama, what with the presence of a descendant of Jamie. I imagine it would have fit well into the dramatic tone that Season 5 would go on to establish, and Camfield himself may have probably directed too, suggesting an exquisite visual style. That said, it does have a teeny tiny drawback of maybe being a tad too soon. Like, remember, World War II was only 20 years prior, and yet they were already considering making an adventure set directly within it. Like, not a subtle allegory or an illusion or anything, but literally unmistakably a World War II adventure. Made in 1967? I don't know how that would have gone down. It sounds a bit like if Series 12 had done an episode based around, I don't know, 9/11 or something. It just sounds like too much of a sore subject to tackle that soon. Still, aside from that, I suppose I am interested in seeing how this adventure would have played out, but at the same time I'm not entirely sure if I'd be willing to sacrifice any of the existing Season 5 stories for its chance in the spotlight. They should definitely give it a Big Finish adaptation though, I'd definitely be down for that. Another story concept which Brian Hales tried to get off the ground in Season 5 was the Queen of Time, intended to be a 4-parter where the Doctor and friends are at the mercy of the villainous Hecuba, the so-called Queen of Time. While Jamie and Victoria are endangered by a variety of time-themed challenges, Hecuba occupies the Doctor's attention with her threats of destroying the TARDIS through the power of her grand chronometer. Basically, this kind of sounds like a retread of one of Hales' previous ideas, the Celestial Toymaker. And there's a reason for that, because Hecuba was described as being a relative of the Toymakers in his brief for the story. And I couldn't find a reason as to why this idea was abandoned, but maybe Innes Lloyd just didn't want to retread over this same ground again? I don't know, conjecture. That said, the idea did finally reach some form of published state, thanks to the assistance of Big Finish Productions, the fine purveyors of audio dramas both Doctor Who related and otherwise. One of their many ranges concerns adapting unmade Doctor Who stories, and The Queen of Time received this treatment in 2013. Adapted to the audio format by Catherine Harvey, the adventure was shifted to a later point in the Second Doctor's timeline, featuring Zoe instead of Victoria, and therefore placing the adventure during Season 6. Fraser Hines and Wendy Padbury reprised their roles for this production, and Caroline Faber was cast in the role of Hecuba, and oh my word does she do a spectacular job in bringing this villainous character to life. Harvey adapts Hales' original concept extremely well. Oh, structurally it does certainly resemble the Celestial Toymaker as expected, with the companions being forced into life-threatening challenges while the Doctor is humiliated by the host, but thanks to the audio format, the premise is allowed to be a lot more extravagant and grandiose, with many great set pieces which would undoubtedly have been extremely difficult or impossible to pull off on a 60s budget. particularly the companions being trapped inside a giant hourglass, a tense sequence where Zoe's biological time clock gets sped up and reversed, and a segment where Hecuba forces the Doctor to literally play a war against her. The Doctor's subplot is also far superior in this outing compared to the original story that inspired it. He's actually an active presence who has tangible chemistry with Hecuba, and participates in a variety of his own challenges to complete, as opposed to the original Toymaker story where the Doctor's mute and invisible and plays the same mind-numbing puzzle game for 3 episodes straight. In fact, this adaptation made me realise that a premise like this requires a particular kind of TARDIS crew to work effectively, and the dynamic of the second Doctor Jamie and Zoe feels far more suitable to this outlandish setting than the first Doctor Stephen and Dodo ever did. Hell, I even prefer Hecuba over the Toymaker. She has much more of a presence and a skin-crawlingly sadistic edge to her, and her promiscuous seductive demeanour contrasting her bloodlust and the disgusting imagery of the meals she eats is very vivid and disturbing. I doubt they'd have been able to get away with that in the 60s.
With all of that in mind, while I certainly think The Queen of Time completely one-ups the original story it was based on, I ultimately think it was for the best that it was abandoned. Like, in case you couldn't tell, I have a lot of issues with the original Toymaker story, and if The Queen of Time had been made in the 60s, I imagine it would have fallen victim to many of the same flaws I have with that one. Plus, I think Harvey brings a lot of extra dimension to this concept that Hales probably would have neglected to include. So, ultimately, yeah, my stance is I would have abandoned it for its own good. Basically. Because, this is great. The last concept potentially crafted for Season 5 was another Brian Hales production, known as The Stones of Darkness.
Allegedly, it would have had the Doctor and his companions arrive at Stonehenge, where they discover it is being used as a transporter by the secret alien in disguise Professor Storp and his species. As supporting human characters disappear and reappear as members of Storp's kin, suspicions are raised, and lead to the revelation that the disguised aliens abduct and replace them with their own kind. They ultimately plan to replace high-ranking human soldiers who have control of nuclear weapons, and use them to decimate the Earth in advance of their own invasion. The Doctor eventually stops them and locks off Stonehenge from their armada.
I couldn't really find any reason as to why this idea was abandoned, but I think it has the potential to be a great gothic horror episode, although probably more fitting to like the early to mid Tom Baker era, like a Stones of Blood or Image of the Fendal type affair, rather than like a second Doctor outing. But yeah, I still wouldn't sacrifice anything in Season 5 to see this thing exist. So now, time for a quick interlude. The chronicles of Roger Dixon's failed submissions.
Roger Dixon was... well, honestly, I have no idea. I assume he was a seasoned and professional writer of some description, but there was virtually no reliable information that I could find out about the man himself. All I can confirm is that he submitted a respectable selection of story ideas to the Doctor Who production office. None of them ever got fleshed out beyond a brief synopsis, and not a single one of them got the green light to go into the scripting or production phase.
Dude seemed to have a tough time getting the go-ahead, and with most of these ideas, I can honestly see why. Rapid fire round, as we take a brief look at his brief ideas which were a brief glimmer on the horizon of this show's creativity.
The Ants. A plotline presumably spitballed for Season 4, where the TARDIS ends up in the Nevada desert, with it and its crew shrunk to minuscule proportions as they encounter super-intelligent ants planning to take over the Earth after being mutated by atomic bomb tests. Honestly sounds like a relatively uninspired mixture of both Planet of Giants and The Web Planet, and I don't particularly yearn for its redundant existence. Bar Kokhba. Another Season 4 offering, where the Doctor and friends end up in 2nd century Palestine, and get involved with the Jewish military leader Bar Kokhba and his rebellion against the Roman Empire. A foundationally solid premise, but it was likely intended as a pure historical, and considering those were being phased out by the time of the Second Doctor's era, it probably would have been an ill fit here. The Sleepwalkers. An early to mid-era concept, where Earth's population has devolved into segregated communities with turbulent societal structures after a great conflict. and the Doctor arrives at one such settlement where the robots they rely on for essentials have broken down. The Doctor mends them, but in doing so attracts the attention of another more hostile community who planned a siege, leaving him in a tricky situation where he has to modify the robots to have defensive capabilities against the attackers. The only other details known about this story are that it would have been a 6-parter and that it probably would have had an elder versus youth commentary. Sounds like something, I suppose. Twin World. Submitted for the same period, this would have been set on a planet which orbits a binary star system and is home to a species whose births always produce twins who are morally opposed. The twins who rule the planet decide which one yields the most power based on the movements of their binary sons, and the evil one is about to take charge. This one honestly sounds kinda stupid and pulpy. The New Machines. Presumably intended for Season 5, it would have involved a race of robots who had previously wiped out their human creators, becoming so advanced that they were now able to recreate said human creators, but are apprehensive to do so because they fear being overthrown in turn, with the Doctor's arrival heightening their paranoia. This honestly sounds like quite an interesting idea with a decent amount of dramatic potential behind it, but without any additional material to elaborate on its intended vision, I'm not going to lose any sleep over its abandonment. The King's Bedtime Story. Another offering for Season 5, cryptically described as featuring the Doctor, Jamie and Victoria being forced to reenact the King's favourite story without changing a single aspect of it. This idea is wide open to interpretation as to which king, human or otherwise, it would feature, what tone the story would take, whether it would be comedic or dramatic, or even if it would be as literal as it sounds. Who even knows? I'd need something more concrete about the premise to make an informed decision. The Return of the Neanderthal. A Season 5 suggestion exploring how the Neanderthals of prehistory were rescued from their presumed extinction and taken to another planet by an alien civilization, having developed telepathy in the meantime and, with the arrival of the Doctor, requesting to return to the Earth in the distant future year of 2016. Suspicious of their motives, the Doctor's paranoia would turn out to be justified, as the Neanderthals would then reveal their plan to enslave all of humanity with their telepathy. This sounds a bit overblown and corny if you ask me, but it totally could have worked in execution. But again, I wouldn't sacrifice any existing story in the season to see it. And finally, an untitled story briefly pondered on for Season 5, where the only expressed detail about it was a visit to a planet much like Earth, except it lacks one fundamental element which we take for granted. Honestly, this kinda sounds like that clip from The Simpsons where they watch a film about a world without zinc.
Hey, what gives?
You said you wanted to live in a world without zinc, Jimmy. Well, now your car has no battery.
But I promised Betty I'd pick her up by 6. I better give her a call.
Ultimately, I think Dixon had a fair few competent ideas, perhaps, but the Doctor Who production office were ultimately right to give them all a miss in favour of what we actually got. So we're going to take another break here, but to recap, the lost story ideas of Season 5 are a significant improvement on those of Season 4. I mean, The Queen of Time is a sequel which vastly improves on its predecessor, and Operation Werewolf has the potential to be a great conspiracy story. But ultimately, I still wouldn't replace any of the existing Season 5 stories with these. It's mostly because I just love Season 5 too much. But, anyway. See you next time, I suppose.